Hello, good morning. Very good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for attending this Global Commons Forum hosted by University of Tokyo, the RIKEN, and supported by Mitsubishi Jisho. First, my name is Naoko Ishii, and I will be your host for today. I would like to first welcome President of RIKEN, Professor Makoto Gonokami, for his opening remarks. この上先生お願いします。
Thank you for introduction. Good morning, everyone. I'm Makoto Gonokami, President of RIKEN. Thank you very much for taking part in the Global Commons Forum, which is jointly hosted by the University of Tokyo Center for Global Commons and RIKEN. On behalf of the host institutions, I would like to say a few words. Many of you are attending today's forum, including online. We are delighted that you have taken an interest in the issue of how to protect our precious, irreplaceable Earth system that is global commons. We would like to thank all those who have agreed to speak at the forum and those who have worked so hard in preparation. Among today's speakers, the distinguished professor and director Johan Rockström here of PIC, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, a key advocate of the planetary boundary concept. In recognition of his being awarded the Tyler Prize, often regarded as the Nobel Prize for the environment, Professor Rockström will give the keynote speech. So, this summer has been very hot in Tokyo. Cherry blossom trees are in increasing pain, and crops in ponds are dying. I feel that Japan is becoming a subtropical climate. According to a statement by European Union's Earth Observation Program, Copernicus, the average global temperature from summer of 2024 was the warmest since record-taking began in 1940. Furthermore, the year from September 2023 to August 2024 was the hottest on record, rising 1.64 degrees above pre-industrial level. The alarm bells continue to ring that our global system is approaching an irreversible tipping point. Humanity was able to develop agriculture, industry, and civilization due to the exceptionally stable and warm climate following the Ice Age known as Holocene. Civilization expanded through the creation and striving for knowledge and technology in the struggle against nature in order to lead a safe and healthy life. Since the Industrial Revolution, science and technology have allowed human activities to expand exponentially. That expansion is now placing a large burden on the foundation of humanity's existence, the Earth itself. We have embodied a situation in which we may cross the boundaries, planetary boundaries. The Earth system is a stable and solid common property of the whole of humanity, symbolized by the term Mother Earth, Haha Naru Daichi, that is the global commons. Supported by Mother Earth, civilization which developed in the pursuit of abundance has thrown off the balance of the Earth's environment and is a growing threat to humanity. On the other hand, science and technology have enabled us to realize that aberrations such as the boiling of the planet and the loss of biodiversity are undeniable facts. The crisis of the survival of the Earth system is self-inflicted by us humans. Therefore, those of us living in the present have a duty to solve this. All of humanity must work as one, generate the knowledge needed for solutions, and work together. The wisdom and skills we have in our hand now are not enough, and we have very little time left. I believe that now is the time for science. The driving force of science is curiosity and the joy of discovery. Importantly, the heart that feels it knows no borders. In other words, science has the power to create empathy by transcending national borders. Scientists around the world must embrace a sense of urgency and responsibility to create new wisdom, to solve global problems, and act to transform society. Based on the universality of science, we must clearly communicate the need for behavioral change to people from diverse cultural backgrounds. That is the responsibility of scientists. However, researchers often do not realize how important their findings are for safeguarding the global commons. For researchers, awareness of the global commons should also provide an opportunity to identify important research topics. In other words, it can also be a driving force for the development of science. It is not only about science for global commons, but also global commons for science. For RIKEN to implement this, we will make efforts with UTokyo Center for Global Commons, CGC, to build a framework for new international coordination with cooperation from PIC, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Although RIKEN and PIC share the same goals, our perspectives differ. I would like to connect them from a higher perspective. This forum will be the first step in building connections to deepen our understanding of transformation scenarios and to create and strengthen collaborative actions on key strategic themes for the global commons. First, the director of PIC, Johan Rockström, whom I introduced earlier, will give a keynote speech on the Earth's Health Check. In September 2024, an initiative to annually assess the planetary boundary health check using the latest data has been launched. In the four sessions which will follow his address, Japanese and international leaders of industry, government, and academia will debate strategies for a bright future that avoids the danger of crossing those boundaries. RIKEN will start a 7-year mid to long-term plan from next April 2025. We are currently drafting the plan. In this plan, we have decided to write that RIKEN's key mission is to link RIKEN's scientific research to government policy recommendations. By connecting RIKEN's advanced scientific knowledge with PIC and UTokyo CDC, I believe this knowledge can be presented for policy proposals in the international community that we can contribute to the world. This will be a great challenge, but I believe that we can pave the way to solving new challenges to meet a future sustainable Earth by holding discussions with diverse stakeholders. I expect that this forum will be a good opportunity for not only RIKEN, but the Japanese academic community as a whole to move in that direction. In conclusion, I wish for your continued support of the activities from RIKEN and the University of Tokyo. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you so much, President Gonokami, for very inspiring opening, and which really set the tone of set the scene of the entire today. So now it's my honor to invite Director and Professor Johan Rockström of PIC for keynote speech. It's titled From Planetary Boundaries to the Global Commons. So, Johan, could you please proceed?
Thank you very much, Naoko, President Gonokami, colleagues, friends. What I want to do now is give you an update on the science, showing the evidence why we need to now become stewards of the entire planet, govern the global commons within planetary boundaries for our prosperity and equity on planet Earth. There are three pieces of scientific evidence that is the basis for this, and I'll go through them very quickly. One is what Professor Gonokami pointed out, the unique stability of the Holocene, the state of the planet that has enabled civilizations to develop. The second is that we're now in the Anthropocene. We're putting so much pressure on the planet that we're hitting the ceiling of biophysical, hardwired processes that regulates the very stability of Earth. And the third critical risk assessment is that we are approaching very fast tipping points. Cross them and we will be drifting away the entire planet towards less and less livable conditions on planet Earth, meaning that we will be handing over to future generations a less and less livable planet. Put those three pieces of evidence together, Anthropocene, Holocene, tipping points, and it leads to the conclusion that we need nothing less than a global framework to navigate our future on planet Earth. And that is what I'll provide to you, and that is what lands in the conclusion that the global commons are fundamental. Here is the evidence that supports Professor Gonokami's introductory statements. So this is the Burke et al. Paper giving the latest update on the glaciological data over the past 400,000 years. And it basically summarizes everything we need to conclude the urgency of action today. Start to the furthest right on this panel. We are at 1.25 degrees Celsius, actually, of global mean surface temperature rise today. The warmest temperature, by the way, on Earth over the past 100,000 years. We're following a pathway to 2.7 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. That is a place we haven't seen for the past 3 million years. So I can tell you with scientific certainty that that is not a place where there's any evidence that we can support with dignity and responsibility a world of 9 billion people on Earth by 2050. Over the past 10,000 years, which is the Holocene, which you see in that cylinder, we've had extraordinarily stable conditions on Earth. I call this today the corridor of life. It is a very narrow corridor of 14 degrees Celsius of global mean surface temperature rise, mean temperature, plus minus 0.5 degrees Celsius. So all the variability since we left the last ice age has been within this very narrow range. So we are already outside of that range, and 1.5 degrees Celsius is therefore a very big number, pushing ourselves far out of the corridor of life, which is the period when we've been able to develop civilizations. How can we conclude that? Well, we've been around as modern humans for 250,000 years, which takes us back to that broader cylinder you see there, which is the broader corridor of life. That is the evidence today that over the past 3 million years, so that corridor goes back 3 million years, we've never exceeded 2 degrees Celsius, the warmest point on Earth, and minus 5 degrees Celsius, and we're in a deep ice age. We've lived as modern humans through 2 of those cycles of ice ages you see there, the cold periods, and we've had 2 warm periods. Now, we leave the last ice age 18,000 years ago, and we come into this very, very stable state, and that's where we transition from hunters and gatherers to sedentary farmers. We go through the Neolithic Revolution, and we kick off the civilizational journey as we know it. So we can today conclude with high degree of certainty that it's thanks to the stability of the Holocene that we've been able to develop the modern world as we know it today. We've lived outside of the Holocene. but we had very rough conditions with huge variability in environmental conditions. This is fundamental because that becomes the reference point for us to measure the safe operating space of the desired state of the planet, the equilibrium state as close as possible to the Holocene. So that is conclusion number one. Science has come now to the point where we know the planet we depend on. It's a Holocene planet. The second piece of this evidence is that we're putting exponential pressures on the planet. We're in the Anthropocene. And here you have the evidence of this. You've probably seen these great acceleration curves. To the red, you have all the socioeconomic pressures from 1750 till today. The x-axis is the same on every graph here. It's the entire period of the industrial era of humanity on Earth. Basically our fossil fuel-driven world economy. You come to 1950, and we go from linear impacts to exponential rise. You see in red all the socioeconomics, population growth, economic growth, all the material use, resource, oil extraction. To the right, you see the response of the planet. Up until 1950, you have linear impacts, and then off we go into exponential rise, greenhouse gases, air pollution, loss of biodiversity, eutrophication. You pick any parameter that matters for human well-being and the economy, for businesses and policy, and they look the same. Up until 1950, you have a linear impact, and then you would go exponential. And we've now reached what we scientifically can call a saturation point. We've filled up the whole space. There's no room anymore to just exploit for free, add value, consume, and create waste. We need a shift in the entire logic of the economy. Now, one of those curves is, as we know, the temperature curve, the hockey stick of rising temperatures due to our fossil fuel burning and degradation of ecosystems. What worries us today is what you see on the graph here. The temperature rise over the past 50 years has been linear at 0.18 degrees Celsius per decade. This is what guides all the climate science, therefore also climate policy. It's the linear relationship that translates into the so-called climate sensitivity as a core of climate models. The drama is that from 2014, we see an acceleration of warming. It's jumping from 0.18 to 0.26 degrees Celsius of warming per decade. And we don't fully understand what is happening. There's something occurring in the Earth system which is accelerating the warming. This is happening despite the fact that we're slowly reducing the pace of rising greenhouse gases. So it's something else than our emissions. It could well be, the most strong candidate, is that the planet is losing resilience, losing its buffering capacity. This is incredibly worrying because we see the same signs of losing, first signs of cracks in the resilience of ecosystems, both on land and increasingly surprises occurring in the ocean. And let me give you just a few examples of that. Here you have just the evidence of the accelerated rate of warming on air temperature. So you see in gray lines how the planet gets warmer and warmer and warmer linearly since 1970 until today. And then suddenly the lines just jump off the chart on air temperature. This is 2023 and 2024. These are El Niño years, so we expect them to be warmer, but they're going well outside previous El Niño years. And the same in the ocean, where we see also the off-the-charts abrupt warming in 2023 and 2024 of surface temperature. Again, we have exceptional warming in the Pacific related to El Niño, but there's something amplified by our human emissions, which we are increasingly seeing as an acceleration, but not even fully understanding. Is it so that the ocean is starting to show signs of weakening its capacity to absorb heat? Remember that 90% of the heat caused by our fossil fuel burning is not in the atmosphere, it's in the ocean. We assume in all our climate models that the ocean will just continue to deliver this service for free to humanity all the way to the end of this century. Are we seeing the signs of cracks in this capacity? We do not know. That is what science is today preoccupied with. The question is science in agreement on this concern over our risk of destabilizing the planet? I would argue yes. This is the summary from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, 6th assessment. I'm just taking out the key statements here. Number one, it's unequivocally established that we're causing the global warming we're seeing and the climate crisis we're experiencing today with all the extreme events, the fires, floods, heat waves, storms, all the disease outbreaks. These are amplified by us humans. But IPCC also today concludes that we are risking the health of the planet, that planetary stability is now on the line. And moreover, we're increasingly understanding that we will never solve the climate crisis by only phasing out fossil fuels. We also need the other planetary boundaries. We need nature. We need up to 50% of biodiversity and stable ecosystems to uphold that buffering capacity, which I mentioned earlier. We're starting to see cracks in that system. Did you know, for example, that the Brazilian part of the Amazon basin, the Earth's richest terrestrial ecosystem, has already tipped over and is no longer a carbon sink. It's actually a net carbon source. This is an early warning. It's not that the Amazon has tipped over yet. It is approaching a tipping point, but it's showing signs of weakening. This is why we need to become stewards of the entire planet. And the science is increasingly, therefore, with very profound evidence showing that necessity. We're talking about Earth resilience, which is the capacity of the planet to dampen stress. And the key indicator of concern there are the tipping points, meaning large biophysical systems that regulates the ability of the planet to remain in this Holocene equilibrium state, push them too far, and they can tip over from their cooling and dampening state, like a permanent ice sheet reflects 90% of incoming heat back to space thanks to the white surface. A melting ice gets much darker, absorbs heat, and becomes a self-reinforcing warming system. That's what we call feedback dynamics that shift from cooling to warming, and that becomes an irreversible tipping point. We have mapped these tipping points, and you see them on this illustration, 16 across the entire planet. 6 of them are up in the Arctic, the Greenland ice sheet being the predominant one of them. They're also connected via the North Atlantic and the overturning of heat, the so-called AMOC system. The Amazon is one of the systems. We have 3 systems in Antarctica, particularly the West Antarctic ice sheet is today close to collapse. We also have the marine ecosystems. I show this illustration to convey 2 messages. One is that the tipping point systems, which we today scientifically argue are global commons, are over the entire planet. They don't follow any national borders, and we all depend on them collectively. And they're both on land, they're ecosystems, they're physical systems in the ocean, they're ice sheets, and they are the heat conveyor belt system across the ocean. We've done the first risk assessment of these tipping point systems. You see them here as a list, 16 climate tipping element systems. By the way, they're also listed in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So this is not one scientific paper. This is established in the scientific consensus. What is new, though, which is just one scientific paper, is the risk assessment you see here in red. This is the so-called IPCC red embers approach. You see the darker the color, the higher is the likelihood of causing irreversible change. The width of these bars are the uncertainty range in science. The circles is the average likelihood point. I just want to point you to the top 5, which are, as you see, likely to cross their tipping points already at 1.5 degrees Celsius of global mean surface temperature rise. At 1.5, they're likely to cross their tipping point. The Greenland ice sheet, the West Antarctic ice sheet, abrupt thawing of permafrost in the boreal region, amplifying warming even further, loss of all tropical coral reef systems, and collapse of the Labrador current sea current. Now, this is a scientific evidence of why we need planetary boundaries. We have hardwired boundaries that we cannot negotiate with, beyond which we risk causing irreversible changes which will undermine the livability on Earth. Those 2 ice sheets represent 10 meters sea level rise. Of course, they won't lead to a tsunami overnight if it would cross a tipping point, but it would mean an irreversible commitment to 10 meters sea level rise, which may take 1,000 years to melt, but it would be unstoppable. The IPCC shows that this is the risk assessment. This is 30 years of scientific advancements, 5 IPCC reports. The risk of crossing irreversible tipping points 30 years ago was thought to be up at 5-6 degrees Celsius, so basically a 0 risk. No one was suggesting that we would reach that kind of warming. But today, the more we learn, the more science advances, the more we understand that the self-regulating planetary system is a fragile system. It has tipping point systems that are likely to cross their irreversible changes already between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. So we have very strong evidence today that we are at risk. So put all of this together We're welcoming the world to the Anthropocene. We cannot exclude tipping points. The Holocene is the only state of the planet we know for certain that can support humanity. That is why we need a planetary boundary framework. The planetary boundaries answer two questions. What are the Earth system processes that regulates the ability of the planet to remain in a Holocene-like equilibrium state? And secondly, can we, for each one of those boundary processes, we've identified 9 boundary processes, you see them here, can we quantify with control variables safe boundaries beyond which we risk causing irreversible changes, but within which we have a high chance of staying within a safe space, a space that enables the planet to remain as close as possible to a Holocene-like equilibrium interglacial state that can support humanity. We've quantified all the 9 boundaries. This is the latest assessment from 2023. 6 of the 9 boundaries are now concluded to be outside of the safe space. It's climate, but it's also biodiversity loss, land system change, overuse of fresh water, overloading of nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, and overloading of chemicals in the Earth system. So this proves that the planet is getting weaker. That is basically what it says. We've been advancing this for 15 years, from 2009 until today. In the beginning, we could not even quantify all the 9. Now we're able to do it, and we see we've gone from 4 boundaries transgressed up to 6 boundaries transgressed just over this 15-year period. We've now committed to the world, and Naoko Ishii is one of the planetary guardians in this initiative, to raise the ambition in science, to do a planetary health check, basically using the planetary boundary science to take the planet to the doctor each year and do a full comprehensive health check to quantify annually, not as we've been done before every 7th year, the state of the planetary boundaries. This led to the first planetary health check released at the New York Climate Week 2 weeks ago, where we for the first time are able to do an annual update on the planetary boundaries, and the vision is to create a mission control room for planet Earth to support not least the global commons. Here you have from the Planetary Health Check assessment. So this is like blood test samples where you have a line showing the level below which you're in the safe space. You enter a danger zone in yellow, which is the uncertainty range in science. And the deeper you go to the right, the higher risk of causing irreversible change. 6 of the 9 boundaries are confirmed to still be outside of the safe space. Ocean acidification is still in the safe space, but moving rapidly unfortunately, beyond the safe space. The key message here are the arrows that we're showing that, unfortunately, all the 6 boundaries that are outside of safe space are still moving in the wrong direction. So we still haven't turned the corner. We've promised the world through the Paris Climate Agreement, through the Global Biodiversity Framework. There's so many policy commitments, but they have not yet delivered. So the key messages here are really that we are still moving in the wrong direction. Science is working very hard in this work, and we look very much forward at the Potsdam Institute to work more closely with RIKEN colleagues and with the Center of Global Commons to understand how we can accelerate the pathway back to a safe space, but also that these boundaries interact with each other. We can today conclude with high degree of scientific certainty that we can never solve the climate crisis by only phasing out fossil fuels. We need nature as a vehicle to succeed in this transition. We've also, through the Earth Commission, which is an effort of creating a global scientific assessment mechanism, bringing in the social sciences and the Earth system sciences to not only assess the safe planetary boundaries, what I've showed you so far, but also the just boundaries. And what this shows when you try to assess the significant harm levels, the maximum level of significant harm that people can tolerate, not surprisingly, this safe space shrinks even further. Because it's not surprising that if the planet can tolerate 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, people cannot tolerate all the way up to 1.5. The latest assessment is that in blue line here, that the just boundary is at 1 degree Celsius of warming. So already at 1 degree Celsius of warming, we are at 1.2 already today, you find millions of people affected on droughts, heat waves, labor productivity, water scarcity, massive impacts of storm insurgence, saltwater insurgence because of sea level rise, and so on and so forth. So what happens if you take justice into consideration is that air pollutants, climate, and nitrogen loading, which is a water quality pollutant, makes the surface shrink even further. Finally then, before closing, we've also addressed what does planetary boundary means for the global commons. And we suggest in a paper that was published recently in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences that we need to redefine the global commons. And this is work that was inspired very much from Naoko Ishii already at the time when you were heading the Global Environment Facility, that, as you know, we have 4 big global commons that are considered legally today. It is Antarctica, it is the deep seas and the high seas of the ocean, it is outer space, and you could argue the atmosphere. Basically, the 4 systems that are outside of national jurisdictions, owned by nobody, therefore owned by all of us. We now argue that that is an obsolete definition, that we now need to redefine it to say that global commons are the biophysical systems on Earth that we all depend on collectively for our livelihoods, irrespective of whether they're inside or outside of national jurisdictions. So if you're a citizen in Japan or in Germany, we all depend on a stable Amazon basin, on a stable Greenland ice sheet, on a stable overturning circulation in the North Atlantic. These are commons that we cannot accept that they cross tipping points because they will hit us back irrespective of where we live on Earth. Here you have the list of those candidates of new global commons. The top line here are all the tipping point systems, the 16 climate tipping point systems that we suggest scientifically should be the first ones to be reclassified legally as global commons. They then become governing units that require legal frameworks, institutions for governance, but also very likely discussions of serious compensation schemes. If you are President Lula in Brazil, you of course have the national jurisdiction and integrity to, it's your property, the Amazon rainforest, but you may be entitled to compensation from the global community to keep that system intact for humanity. And they are, as I mentioned, across the entire planet. They are the big ecosystems that we all depend on collectively. And to close, it therefore means an integration of the global commons within planetary boundaries in a very explicit, quantitative way to guide both policy, business, and the economy in the world. So I think what the Center of Global Commons is doing is trying to bring the Earth system components of the big spheres that regulate the stability of the planet into a planetary stewardship framework for humanity's ability to navigate our future on planet Earth. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Johan. Such inspirational, exciting, scary the remarks. And now we will have about 20 minutes to actually to go through and reflect a little bit of our journey regarding the global commons. It was actually 2015 when that serious negotiation was conducted in Paris. If you remember, we had a dinner at some of the restaurants in Paris to really think about, okay, it's going to be historic accord. Finally, the entire world come together to think about how to do this climate change together. But do we really have a good mechanism to implement this goal? And as you said from the beginning, it's not just a climate and energy transition. It has to be more united, a planetary system. So the conversation at that night is, could we really come together serious and think about how we could come up with a mechanism to govern this global commons? And a year later, a few months later, in Washington, we initiated Global Commons Dialogue. And I see some of the speakers, including Peter Barker, was actually present to be part of this conversation. That's how Global Commons Dialogue started. And since then, as your presentation made so clearly, the science has made quite a dramatic progress. And they are telling us year by year from now on that where we are in terms of our relationship with nature or the planet Earth, the challenge is that are we, the humans, have made enough progress to catch up with or to deal with this message from the science? And I think we will more or less agree that the progress is not really commensurate with the speed and scale which requires for us to govern the global commons. So one of the questions I have for next 20 minutes with you is that maybe 3 blocks. The first one is about science. The second one is how can we do better to govern the global commons. The last one is a little bit of the governing mechanism. So maybe first question for you. In terms of the scientific background or planetary boundary science, you have emphasized a lot about resilience this time. And also you made a very strong point that everything is kind of interconnected. So if you could just emphasize one more time why this resilience factor becomes so important to this conversation.
Thanks, Naoko. Does it start by itself? There we are. Yeah, there we are. So, yeah, thanks, Naoko. And I think these 3 areas would be great to cover. And let me just first define resilience. What do we mean by Earth resilience? In essence, it's the capacity of the Earth system to buffer, to dampen stress. So basically to keep the planet in a stable state. And it could be good to remind that what is it that takes the planet out of an ice age? Because it's a temperature difference from something like -5, -6 to something like +1. So it's a 5-6 degrees Celsius global mean surface temperature rise. Well, it's only 1/3 of that, roughly, which is based on rising solar radiation. The rest is biosphere feedbacks. The rest is how the planet responds in all its living systems. It is photosynthesis, it is biomass, it is ice, it is heat exchange in the ocean. It's all the chemical circulation of greenhouse gases, nitrous oxide, methane, carbon. So that is resilience. This is what determines the functioning of the Earth system. So when we are exploring Earth resilience, we're trying to investigate what is the ability of the planet to dampen and buffer the stress, in this case, not caused by the sun, but caused by us. And that is the entry point. And what we find is that biodiversity, the living ecosystems, all the biology on planet Earth plays a fundamental role to keep the planet in a livable, stable state. And that we've had this enormous privilege over the last 150 years when we have increased the stress on planet Earth by emitting greenhouse gases, that over half of that enormous debt to the planet has been buffered by the planet, by a healthy planet that has been able to absorb carbon dioxide on land, 25%, another 25% in the ocean, 90% of heat. All of this is a healthy planet under stress, applying its phenomenal geophysical resilience capacity. And that is what we're now trying to measure fully at the planetary scale to avoid that we tip out of that equilibrium state. So that is resilience, and it's increasingly, let's say, a very explicit science, and also something that we methodologically are able to measure at very high resolution, very much thanks to big data capacity, Earth observation data, all the modeling tools we have today.
Thank you so much. So let's talk a little bit about the progress being made or not being made about how to cope with this scientific message in the real world. And here, since 2015, many of us have emphasized importance of system change, because from this scientific view, it's very clear that our economic or human system has put us so much pressure on the planetary Earth system. So this time, it's our turn to change our system so that we can continue to live in harmony with planetary Earth system. So from that point of view, the system change is critical, but it's not really easy to say that. And we all realized at a huge cost that it takes a lot of effort, it needs a lot of creativity, and it needs a lot of challenge and actually leadership. So from your point of view, a scientist point of view, and presenting this planetary boundary framework, what do you think we need to do more to bring those collective courage and wisdom to move forward?
Yeah, I think that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And but one thing that we conclude, I mean, what is a system change that is required? Well, it is an integrated, scaled, globally scaled changes in how we run the global economy, how we run resource use, how we relate to each other as human beings, and how we relate ourselves with planet Earth. So we're talking of nothing less than a massive paradigm shift that collides with the urgency, with the fact that the only currency that counts today is speed and scale, because it's in the next 5-10 years, very likely, that we determine the outcome for the next 50, 100 years, probably potentially 1,000 years. So we cannot wait for a deep, new theoretical paradigm shift. We have to somehow enable this system change to occur within the current systems we have. So we have to work with the system, not against the system. That's why I'm, for example, of the view that on climate, for example, I think we should celebrate the fact that we've negotiated for 30 years. We have all the legally binding frameworks we need. We don't need more commitments. The 1.5 degrees Celsius limit is established legally by all countries. If you look at the Dubai statement, we've agreed to accelerate the phase out of fossil fuels in line with science this decade. It's signed by all countries in the world. So we need to start implementing. And I think to your point, Naoko, therefore, to me, system change in the immediate is really of finding the levers that can unlock rapid change at the global level. And this requires, at this stage of uncertainty in geopolitics and the pushbacks we're seeing and the challenges that particularly businesses are seeing, that policy must step up. I think we must engage more deeply with policy and for example, put a global price on carbon, have end dates on the internal combustion engine, start being more brave in setting not only goals, but starting to implement against those goals and recognize that all science shows we need to cut global emissions by half over the next 5 years. It's a very concrete state. It's 7% per year. We simply have to get it done with. And the beauty, by the way, of this is that we know how to do it. I mean, it's not fantasy anymore. The solutions are there. It's just that it's a very bumpy transition right now where things are very messy. And there are a lot of winners and losers along the way here. But the fact that stepping up the policy dialogue, I think, is fundamental.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe you could put a slide on the back. Yeah, thank you. Actually, Johan, you already signed up this paper. This is a stewardship, Global Commons Stewardship Framework paper, and actually done by many of the colleagues here, including Guido. That then we try to really think that what kind of framework we need to transform the system. So we identify 4 systems, that then energy transition, that then food system, city system, and circularity. And as you said, the newness of this framework is we try to identify action levers or enablers. So these are those 4 the columns. The first one is vision, like Paris Accord, maybe the global goal for nature. And then the second column is actually the economic metrics, like putting price on emission and how to change the financial system. So these are the economic policy level. The third one is slightly different. This is how to incorporate justice into this transition, because we also learn at high cost without really paying attention to justice, and none of this sustainability is maintained or transformation maintained. So that's the third pillar. The fourth pillar is actually technology, which is also related to other pillars, because after Paris Agreement, we have seen that an explosion of decarbonization technology. We call it its Paris effect, because the entire world is thinking, or world is going to that direction. That kind of conviction actually does spur the technological progress. So it also shown us that this the vision and the comment from the leaders is exceedingly important to spur the technological progress, and that one could be good for us, but could also derail that the transformation. It's a very, very important lever here. But all of that together with all of them, then the question going back to us that can we really make best use of those kind of framework? And if not, where we need to strengthen? And you gave us the answer that maybe that the pricing or taxation or how to change this incentive or disincentive structure seems to be exceedingly important. It's one of those green pillars. That can be said for carbon or decarbonization effort. You said that we more or less know how to do it. But that, to me, another big challenge is how can we do the nature positive economy? Because nature really doesn't have a price yet. That's very different from carbon. Carbon, we have a global carbon budget. Nature, yes, we see the limit, and then we see that target. But how to operationalize that nature into our day-to-day economic decision making is another big challenge. So to me, yes, on energy transition, we more or less know how to do it. It's more like, do we do it or we don't do it? But for nature, I think we need a little more the creativity that how we can really come up with those economic metrics. And when you mentioned compensation, okay, so the current economic system doesn't really reward that the people and the entities who safeguard the nature on the ground. And they are just safeguarding that their forest on the ocean or the land and without being even recognized. So how can we really change the economic system to reward those the people on the ground, more like guardians you mentioned, that can we come up with that kind of economic system to, in a sense, to compensate their effort, but not as a cash handout. It's more like how the economic system can incorporate that kind of, the lever into the system. Do you have any view on that?
No, I mean, it's, I think you're putting your finger on, well, to begin with, I think this framework is something that is very useful, and it helps us tremendously because the 4 system transformations here, we show time and time again in our scenario analysis that if we get it right on decarbonizing the energy system, on the food system transformation, on circularity for material resource use and sustainable design of our urban environments, then we have come a very long way in coming back into a safe operating space for humanity. So that, I think, is incredibly useful, not least because we have solutions across all of those. But what are the economic levers we can play with? And I think that one part of that is of course to get the risk assessment right, and to therefore enable financial institutions and insurance companies and all economic risk capital to shift from continuing to risk putting their capital on stranded assets to instead build more resilient, sustainable use of capital. So I think that is one lever which requires science. It requires big science to be able to get really high resolution, real-time risk assessments on what does it mean for value chains to have high risk exposure to different extreme events and crossing tipping points and collapse of ecosystems, for example, because every business is somewhere in the value chain dependent on functioning biosphere or climate systems, even if it's only talking about labor productivity to avoid life-threatening heat, for example. So I think that is one entry point. But otherwise, I also think that we need to reopen the discussion on economic policies in governance to shift this huge perverse market failure where we are subsidizing planet-ruining production and consumption practices, and the only way to do planet-harmonized production and consumption is through our willingness to pay more, which we know can work up to 10% of populations because you have an educated, aware, younger, urban elite. I call them elite because they are one part of the civilization. But we know that the only way to get this really to be 100% of citizens joining the transformation, which is, by the way, the only way we can really get a global systems transformation, is if it becomes easier, cheaper, and more straightforward to make the right choices in life. I mean, I sometimes tell my students that the moment we've really succeeded in solving the planet's challenges is the moment where citizens do the right thing without even knowing that they are supporting the sustainability transition, because they simply do it because it's the smartest choice. It's cheaper, it's smarter, it's more healthy, it's more attractive, it's tastier, it's simply a better option. And the beauty is that we see more and more evidence that we have scalable solutions that tick off all those boxes. That's quite interesting. I mean, electric mobility is much more attractive, much more modern, much cooler, much healthier, and increasingly also economically viable, even without subsidies. So I think this is the pathway we need to choose, and that can only be achieved by taking steps on internalizing externalities, economic policies that, to put it bluntly, punish the planet-damaging practices and reward the planet-harmonized practices. And we know how to do this. Even mainstream economics agrees that, you know, all forms of subsidies are bad things, and externalities deteriorate the functioning of markets. So I think that is necessary. But third and final, Naoko, I think what you've been leading on is fundamental here, to redefine the global commons and to use legal systems, to use the courtrooms to support also our compliance, to stay within safe boundaries. And when you have, you know, if you would have the Amazon Basin as a global commons with a legal treaty, just as powerful treaty as the Antarctic Treaty, then of course you can, with that treaty, have compliance and have in place systems where countries actually have to compensate for preserving that system. And you can have monitoring today down to the single tree, actually, whether President Lula is conforming with that treaty. So I think we need to also play with on many fronts to be able to achieve this economic logic of that transition.
Yeah, thank you. It's very encouraging to hear, because one of the projects we are actually proceeding together with some of our allies is how to update the economic system to reward those actions on safeguarding global commons on the ground. And without that, as you said, still those sustainable products are expensive, and it's going to be just the commodity only the rich people can afford. We have to really completely change it, and the sustainability should be our day-to-day product. So that then to make it happen, we need to really shift the entire ecosystem, including pricing, the subsidies, and the finance, and actually our value system too. So it's going to be a very comprehensive journey. Journey will continue going forward. But my last question for you is that one of the slides you showed is an just space, not only a safe space, but just space. That then it seems to me many people do love it, because they also feel that the original planetary boundary really doesn't, or they don't see that where the human faces it. So it's a huge challenge to put this in a just space, just angle in it. But I'm also wondering that then how challenging to operationalize it, and in the same way that then the safe space being operationalized. So it has been already 2-3 years since that you launched this just operating space. And can you share with us a bit of the takeaway of the last 3 years since you launched it? And could we learn a lesson that how we can make best use of this just concept in these planetary boundaries?
Thanks, Naoko. Yes, I mean, there are many lessons, but I can also start by saying that we're still advancing this. It's still work in progress. So if any one of you have ideas or experiences of how to integrate justice into the sustainability agenda, it would be really interesting to discuss this. Let me start by just saying, and I'm kind of looking at you a bit here, Peter Bakker, that you know, businesses across the world have come a long way in understanding to translate the planetary boundary on climate into action for climate along the value chains of business. And it's a very big progress in that area. I mean, it's not fast enough, but it's a progress. And therefore, now asking businesses to do the same thing for all the 9 planetary boundaries is a big ask. To ask societies to do it is a big ask. So therefore, the conclusion we've drawn scientifically even is that to start with the safe planetary boundaries, which are the quantitative boundaries that have the longest scientific legacy, we have really, really strong confidence, we have quite precise numbers, they're ready to be operationalized. That is where we should start, with the safe boundaries. But the safe boundaries, as Naoko says, yes, they are focused on the biophysics of keeping the planet in a stable state. But that is, I think, what we should start with. That's what the Planetary Guardians are doing, that's what the Planetary Health Check is doing. But you're absolutely right that justice is so fundamental. And we can even say today that if we don't address justice, we will very likely not be able to accelerate the transformations that can deliver on the safe boundaries. And it's even increasingly shown the other way around as well, that justice itself is a prerequisite to be able to achieve boundaries, and boundary transgressions have massive inequity and therefore justice implications. So justice is fundamental, but it's much more complicated. And as I showed, it shrinks the space even further, which is no surprise at all. I mean, you can just imagine air pollution, for example. The planet can tolerate much more air pollution than our lungs can as humans. So it's not surprising that the just boundary is much, much lower than the safe boundary. And how do we work that in a systems transition fashion remains a challenge. But I think it's important to integrate both, to continue working on both. And of course, it's very likely that the just boundaries become more of the local air standards work in cities, for example. That's where the just boundaries really hit the road in a concrete way. But then that the safe boundaries becomes more the integrating framework for the stability of the global commons at the global level, at the regional to global level. So I think integrating them is a very healthy and necessary step. But I don't think we should complicate things. We should not overly complicate things, because we might, in that case, drown and never get really concrete in our implementation. We want implementation right now.
Thank you. So we need implementation now. That is the takeaway from this session. Thank you so much, Johan. Thank you so much. This is a very interesting conversation. So could you please give him an applause? Thank you.